My mother is strong, independent, and hardworking. She worked her ass off as a sergeant in the army until she was honorably discharged after she was raped by a fellow sergeant. After that, she went on to work in a maximum security prison in Georgia. And this is where she met my father, who was also a corrections officer. When they first met, they bonded over basketball. My mom was somewhat of a basketball star when she was in high school, but many college scouts overlooked her because of her height and color. My father, on the other hand, was able to go to college for it, until the day that he hurt his knee and had to drop out and search for a different career. Mom says that everything was great. They were the it couple, a beautiful couple. She still says that he was one of the most handsome men she ever saw. He was smart, fit, charming, and funny. Life was perfect until he moved in with her a year into the relationship. Then everything went downhill. She says that some days she would come home from work to find him in a drunken stupor, with lines of coke spread out on her coffee table. They would then argue and she would toss out his bottles of Jack. But he would smack her across the face and beat her throughout the night. She would have no choice but to go into work the next day, sore and with bruises on her face and black eyes. Her neighbors and her coworkers knew what was going on, but they turned a blind eye. The warden, however, threatened to fire her because it wasn't good for the inmates to see her like that. My mom decided that she would kick Dad out. She would cut all ties and get an order of protection against him. That is, until she found out that she was pregnant with me. She put off breaking up with him for a while, working double shifts as to not go home and basically living at the prison. Ironically, that was the only place where she felt safe. One day she went home and he was there, sober for once. She told him about the pregnancy, and by then she was about 2 months along. He went off, saying that he wasn't ready for a child, and he demanded that she get an abortion. He gave her money for it the next day before he went to work, but instead of an abortion, she spent the money he gave her at the mall. When she got home, he asked if she got it done. She said no, explaining that she was 32 and she wasn't getting any younger, and that she had always wanted a child. She was ready to raise the child with or without him. He glared at her. His eyes were full of hatred. If looks could kill, she would have dropped dead right then and there. He just nodded and said, "Fine, keep it," and stomped off to bed. My mom says she was surprised because she expected that he would go off on her. She began to feel hopeful that maybe he would stop abusing her, stay sober, and that they could live happily again. She dismissed the glare as just something from her imagination and followed him to bed because she had to wake early the next day for work. Sometime during the night, she woke up to find him leaning over her, holding a huge knife to her throat, the same evil look in his eyes from before.
"You don't want to do what I tell you, bitch? I'll cut that fucking baby out of you right now,"
he said. They fought, rolling off the bed, crashing to the floor. Somehow she was able to knock the knife out of his hand and it skidded under the bed, out of his reach. He then picked her up by her hair and threw her against the wall and punched her repeatedly in the stomach, chest, and face. She did the only thing she could and kicked him in the crotch as hard as she could. He let out a yelp and dropped to his knees.
"Ah, you fucking bitch!"
he hollered, cupping his crotch. My mom quickly grabbed her car keys and ran out of the bedroom. She says that her stomach felt like it was on fire. She got to the living room, wanting to grab her purse before she left. She felt around for it but couldn't find it. My father must have worked through his pain because my mom says he soon followed her.
"You're not leaving, bitch,"
he stated, heading towards the kitchen. She felt a shiver run through her body. She knew if she didn't leave right then, she would die that night. He was going for another knife. She knew she wouldn't make it to the front door since the kitchen was right next to it, and in her condition, there was no way she could run to the door before he got to her. As she heard my father rummaging in the kitchen, calling her all types of names, she threw open the living room window, pushed out the screen, and climbed out. She hung from her hands, closed her eyes, began praying, and let herself drop. She fell onto a large air conditioning unit, landing on her knees and elbows. It hurt so much, but thankfully she was alive. Thanking God, she crawled off and limped to the parking lot where her car was. She drove off, never looking back. My mom says she left her whole life behind that day, her pretty condo, her friends, and a job she loved. She escaped to New York where my grandmother lived. All because my father, a man she loved and someone she thought loved her back, tried to kill her when she was pregnant with me. When I was about 11, I had a steady babysitter named Jane. My brother and sister were 17 and 18, so they were either too cool to babysit me or busy with school around this time. Jane was their age, but I don't think her family had a lot of money, so she would babysit me almost every weekend instead of doing normal teenager stuff. My family lived in a pretty well-to-do cul-de-sac in the back of a large neighborhood. It was one of those neighborhoods where the houses got nicer the further back you went. The houses at the front, by the main road, were not as nice but still not terrible or anything. This is where Jane lived. Since I was 11 and prepubescent, I was a huge pain in the ass, but never to Jane. I looked at her as a best friend. We did so many fun things together and I could truly tell that Jane loved me. One Saturday night, my mom was making plans for the next weekend. But for the first time, Jane couldn't babysit. Jane had her first prom. She was very excited because the boy she had had a crush on for years asked her, and I knew all about this because she had been telling me about him since she started high school. My mother and I were both very excited for her, and I saw my mom hand her way more money than usual. Jane's eyes teared up, and she gave us both a hug and left. Since this was the mid-90s, everybody got babysitters from word of mouth. My mom heard from another mother that a girl that used to babysit for her kids had just moved back to her parents' house after grad school. She lived down the street from Jane, and her name was Becky. My mom called Becky up to see if she could babysit me that Saturday. Becky excitedly said yes, and proceeded to ask my mom somewhat strange but not entirely alarming questions. How tall I was, what I looked like, etc. There might have been other questions, but I was just hearing my mom's side of the conversation. When she hung up, my mom said to my dad, "Wow, she's really thorough." I was a little nervous, as Jane had been the only one to babysit me for years. In the rare instances where she couldn't do it, my parents usually canceled their plans. But this was a work party, and my dad was being honored, so that wasn't an option at all. A couple of days before Becky was to come, I begged my mom to call Jane. I wanted to see if I could go over the night of prom and see her in her dress. My mom kept telling me that she wouldn't want me there and that I could just see pictures, but I insisted. So my mom called Jane and handed the phone to me. "Hey there, May, how are you?" "I'm good. I wanted to see if I could come over on Saturday and see you in your prom dress." "Of course. I'm getting my hair done, but you can come after that, maybe around 5:30. Just tell your mom to call first and make sure that I am here." "Oh, it won't be my mom. It'll be Becky." This was followed by dead silence. "Wait, what?" "Since you couldn't watch me, my mom found a girl named Becky to do it." Again, a long pause. "Oh, okay, sweetie, that's fine." She hurriedly got me off the phone. I went to school the next day and came home to my mom hanging up the phone, shaking her head. Oh dear, poor Jane. Her date doesn't want to take her anymore. They had a fight. She wanted to know if she could still watch you this Saturday, but I feel bad about canceling on Becky, but it's completely up to you. Of course, I chose Jane. And as usual, we had tons of fun. I didn't bring up the prom because I didn't want to make her sad. But then she asked me if I wanted to play dress up. We did each other's hair and put on my mom's dresses and took pictures with my mother's Polaroid. It was the best night of an 11-year-old's life. Jane went to community college, and by the time she went to a 4-year school, I no longer needed a babysitter. We kept in touch a little after that, but before long, we both got busy and we lost touch. And this was where the story ended, until this past weekend. I ran into Jane at a bar, and she was not sober. In fact, she was very drunk. She didn't seem to be doing well. She was very thin and it looked like she had track marks on her arms. This made me extremely sad, because she was one of the people I loved most in the world, at least at one time in my life. I sat next to her at the bar and asked how she was doing. Her face lit up and she gave me a big hug. "Look at you. I always knew you would do well for yourself. Look at you. You're all grown up and beautiful. You look great too, Jane." "No, I don't, but it's okay." We started talking, and throughout our conversation, she was drinking even more. I got the feeling that she was in blackout territory. She was with a group of people that seemed to be her friends, so I wasn't entirely worried for her, but I still didn't want to leave her for some reason. She seemed really happy to see me, and we started reminiscing. Once it was my turn to bring up a story again, I said, "Remember when that dirtbag stood you up for prom, so we staged our own prom with pictures and everything? Oh, that was great." She looked at me through foggy eyes and smiled a small smile. "He didn't actually stand me up. The replacement babysitter was a sick fuck. When I was little, she beat me, sexually abused me, threatened me, and locked me in closets. And then she would invite her boyfriend to do the same things to me. She told me if I ever told anyone, she would kill my family, and I would have to live in an orphanage. She took pictures of me too, and I had repressed it all until you said her name that day. Now it's all back. All of it. I should have told someone, but it's too late now. I just didn't want people to know what happened to me. I thought they would look at me differently, and now I regret so much. Who knows what else she did?" She set down her drink and gave me a hug and "It's been good to see you," like she hadn't just dropped a major bomb on me. She stumbled out of the bar with her boyfriend. Everything then came flooding back to me. The phone conversation with Becky with all the details, Jane's silence when I said Becky's name, how Jane stayed with me every single weekend until I was old enough to not need a babysitter. Some people might say that Jane should have told someone, but she was just a kid. She was an extraordinary kid at that. She gave up her prom to save me, and she gave up every single weekend after that so that nothing would ever happen to me. She was my guardian angel, and unfortunately, Jane didn't have her own Jane, and this makes me feel horrible. As a young girl, my family and church often spoke to us about God, the devil, and the many temptations we face every day. I was told that a sin committed willingly was an invitation to the devil, one that would allow him to enter our bodies and enact his evil onto others. Like many of the younger children in our congregation, I dreaded the day that I would give in and commit a sin that would turn me into the devil's puppet and bring shame and suffering to my family and church. Over the years, however, talk of sin and the devil began to feel like a boring routine, and it no longer scared me the way it did when I was little. While I still firmly believed in God, I became convinced that because I was a good person who did my best to avoid hurting those around me, I had little reason to fear sin. I was sure that the devil was my church and family's version of the boogeyman, a mythical figure used to convince our congregation to follow the path of the righteous. This belief made me careless, and this carelessness dramatically changed my life within my church and family. After I finished elementary school, my father decided to no longer enroll his children in public school, and instead had my mom homeschool us while he worked as a mechanic. I was 17 when I told my 13-year-old sister Emily that the devil wasn't real. Every day after our lessons, Emily and I would make our way out into the desert. While our house was officially within city limits, the desert that surrounded us allowed my sister and me to make believe that we were the only people in the world. This feeling was heightened by the tall mountains that surrounded us, which gave our land an almost eerie feel. On this given day, we were on the hunt for cottontails. We had never been lucky enough to catch one, but the idea of having one as a pet, although unrealistic, enticed us. Emily was quieter than usual, however, and when I asked her what was wrong, she began to cry. I hugged her tightly and asked what was wrong. At first, what she said did not make sense. She wouldn't stop saying something about wanting to give it back, that all she wanted was the devil to leave her. When I managed to calm her down, she explained that while in the store with Mom, she had seen a bracelet that caught her attention and that she really wanted to have. We were struggling financially at the time, and our parents had been clear that we could not be wasteful with the little money we had. So Emily, a child with little impulse control, put the bracelet on and then pretended to forget that she was wearing it as she walked out of the store. By the time she was in the car, she was feeling guilty about what she had done but was too ashamed to walk back inside and admit her actions. After arriving home from the store, Emily and Mother prepared dinner together, but while they were cooking, Mother burned her hand. Emily, who was still unsettled by her earlier behavior, took this as a sign that she had the devil inside her and was now causing harm to her family. In my efforts to console Emily, I told her that the devil wasn't real. He was only used to scare us, and that God knew she was a good person and would forgive this mistake she made because she was truly sorry for her behavior. As I told this to Emily, she looked at me in disbelief, but remained silent except for the fading whimpers from her meltdown. That night, I had trouble sleeping because I knew I had been too open about my beliefs, and that in an attempt to help me, Emily would tell our parents what I had said. The following weekend, my mother called me down to help her prepare dinner. As I reached the first floor, I realized that I would not be preparing our food anytime soon. On the couch across from my parents sat Pastor Mason and his wife, Ruth. The four of them wanted to speak with me. Ruth, the pastor's wife, was the first to scold me for what I had said to Emily. Although her voice at first was cold yet calm, by the end of her rant, she was yelling hysterically and had stood up while everyone else remained seated. She told me that I had no right to corrupt the mind of a young girl that way, and that she would not let me infect her church with my stupid, faithless thoughts. After her rant was over, my mother looked at me with tears in her eyes and simply told me that she was disappointed in me. The pastor then stated that I should consider whether I truly wanted to be a child of God, to which I tried to reply that yes, I was a child of God, but before I could finish, he interrupted me and said in kind words that I should go upstairs and reflect on what we had discussed. He told me that he would see me the next day, Sunday, at church. I cried for most of the evening and again in the morning after I woke up. During church that Sunday, Ruth asked everyone to keep me in their prayers while I struggled with my faith. Apparently, everyone was already aware about what I stupidly said to my sister. After this incident, people began to treat me differently and always looked at me with suspicion in their eyes. I wasn't friendless, but people kept their distance. The girls who were my friends no longer invited me to their houses and kept our interactions at church events only. During this time, 16-year-old Nathan and I became close. Surprisingly, the adults in our church did not object. As a pastor's nephew, Nathan was trusted by all and they expected that he would help revitalize my faith. Nathan was one of the few teenagers in our congregation that attended public school. During our conversations, I was always curious and sometimes in awe by his experience at his school. Our relationship quickly progressed until the moment we decided to have sex. The alienation I felt from my family and church made me care less about the rules, so as my feelings towards him grew stronger, I wanted to be close to him. He said he loved me and wanted us to be together, and I consented. Our moment was short, awkward, and painful. Afterwards, I prayed day and night that no one would find out. If everyone had turned against me for a stupid comment, what would they do to me after they found out I was no longer a virgin? A few months later, my body began to change. I, along with everyone else, found out I was pregnant. After my pregnancy was confirmed by the doctor, I was confronted by my parents, Nathan's parents, Pastor Mason, and Saint Ruth. This time, the yelling began immediately. Ruth blamed me for corrupting Nathan and taking away his innocence. Boys, I was told, have urges that they have no control over, and it had been my responsibility to keep our friendship pure. She regretted that she hadn't done enough to save me when they first found out I was drifting towards sin. But this was no excuse for willingly giving myself to the devil. Nathan was the blameless victim, while I had become the devil incarnate. During the early stages of my pregnancy, the pastor and Ruth would always talk about how the church was being tested and how everyone should pray I find the strength to rid myself of the devil. They saw my pregnancy as an affliction, as a sign of my sin, but never as the life that was growing inside me. Years later, this seems even more ridiculous and disgusting because a cousin of Ruth had raped his wife's niece. Although he had been sent to jail, the girl was told that she needed to love the baby because God had given it to her. I guess the same logic didn't apply to me. It didn't matter to me, however. Their hate made my love for my baby stronger, and my baby's company made my loneliness easier to bear. During this time, my family made little effort to reconnect with me. Their loyalty was to the church, and I was a burden to them. I still loved my family, but it seemed like their love for me had evaporated. A little over a month from my due date, my family began to focus their attention on me. They told me repeatedly that they knew that God would find a way to redeem me, that I wasn't completely lost yet, and that they knew that soon they would have their daughter again. After church one Sunday, I was asked to remain in my room and to only come out for the bathroom and dinner. The next day, I was told that they would bring my food to my room instead. After I became pregnant, my room had been moved downstairs to the small room by the living room that had once been our music room. The smaller than normal window made my prison somewhat bearable. Each day, however, I felt increasingly sick, and I wasn't sure if it was just due to my pregnancy or the fact that I was stuck in my room. One day, my mother invited me to sit outside in the porch with her. The sunset was beautiful, mainly because I hadn't seen one in days. We were mostly silent, but she seemed happy. And for the first time since I became pregnant, she seemed to appreciate my company. We talked a little about the pleasant weather, church, God, Emily, and Dad, but never about me. I didn't mind though. Just feeling like I had a mother was good enough for me. Before she walked me back to my room, she touched my belly, smiled, and said, "Soon. God always does what's best." I smiled, nervous and excited, agreeing that yes, it wasn't long before my baby would be born, and happy that it seemed like my mom was starting to accept the baby. 3 nights later, I woke up with horrible pain in my stomach. My feelings of sickness had increased every day before that night. When I turned on my lamp, I saw that I was bleeding. I never got to meet my baby Anna, never got to hold her, kiss her, or hear her cry. I did, however, mourn her, and I was the only one who did so. The weekend after my miscarriage, my family dragged me to church. Everyone seemed joyful, and I had many people tell me, "Welcome back," or "We've missed you." My parents held my hands as I heard the pastor talk about how once again we had witnessed the strength of the church, how members of our congregation had been tested and thrived, and how I had been able to give into the power of faith and allowed the Lord to save me. Nathan's parents seemed overjoyed, and I could tell that Nathan was relieved that he would not have to be responsible for my baby. No one ever said they were sorry to hear about what happened. Even if one of them wanted to, they weren't compelled enough to ruin the celebration that was unfolding that day in church. My parents hadn't spoken to me about my baby after we left the hospital. They hugged and kissed me at home, just like you would do with a loved one that has returned from a long trip, and they were obviously moving on with their lives. Taking me to church that day was their way of saying, "It's time for you to move on too." Once the singing had died down, Nathan approached me. As he left his mother's side, I could tell that she was displeased. When he reached me, he said, "I'm really glad you found salvation." While his words hurt me deeply, I didn't cry. Instead, I punched his face. I punched as hard as I could, and I'm not even sure if it hurt him, but I was done with all of them and I wanted everyone to know that. My parents yelled at me all the way home and continued to do so after we arrived home. Their love quickly faded once again. No one spoke to me after for the next few days. One night, my sister approached me when I was sitting in the living room looking out the window and said with tears in her eyes,
"I'm so sorry about your baby. How I wish I could have met her."
My mom, who was cleaning the kitchen, heard her say this and immediately walked into the living room and told Emily to go to her room. Emily avoided me afterwards. On a Thursday, 2 weeks after the incident with Nathan, my family was at church again. After they had been gone for at least an hour, I walked into my parents' room, opened their bottom drawer, opened their savings envelope, and took $500. It was my birthday. After putting a few pieces of clothing into a bag, I got on my bike and rode to the bus station. That ride was almost unbearable. The afternoon heat was suffocating and my water bottle was empty. I reached the counter, sweaty and thirsty, and bought a ticket for a bus that would take me to the state capitol, only an hour away. I slept in a dirty motel after arriving at my destination, and by some miracle I was able to get a job at a nearby gas station before the money ran out. I guess miracles only happen sometimes. It's been a little over 7 years, and I have rebuilt part of my life, even attending community college. I am still religious, but I have since realized that whatever that church was preaching is not Christianity. One thing I have never been able to rid myself of is the suspicion that my parents played a part in my miscarriage. What my mother said right before it happened, that God always does what's best, convinces me that she knew what was going to happen to me and my baby. I have always wondered how they could have done it, but after reading about the woman who poisoned her 2 pregnant friends who later miscarried, I fear that my parents could have done something similar. I hope for my sanity that I am wrong. I don't want this to be the story about how I was mistreated or rejected. Instead, I want this to be the story about how those I cared about the most turned against my innocent baby. Anna, I will always miss you. Rest in peace, my little angel.